Edward Garcia didn't just walk into the New York Supreme Court, he conquered it. At 54, he was the titan of Garcia International, a man whose skyscraper-sized ego was currently draped in a $6,000 charcoal suit. On his arm was Tiffany, a 24-year-old fitness influencer whose perfume smelled of status and stolen time. Across the aisle sat Ruth Clark, the woman who had spent 30 years building his empire from a basement office, now looking small and aged out. Edward smirked, certain that today's hearing would be a mere formality to erase her from his life and his bank account, forever. The air outside the courthouse was a jagged, late October chill that tasted of salt and exhaust. It was the kind of New York morning that made ordinary people pull their coats tight and hurry toward the subway. But for Edward Garcia, the cold was merely a backdrop for his brilliance. When the black-armored SUV pulled to the curb, the flashbulbs exploded like 1,000 tiny suns. Edward stepped out first, adjusting his silk tie with the practiced ease of a man who saw his reflection on the cover of Fortune more often than in a mirror. He didn't reach back for the woman following him. He didn't have to. Tiffany slid out with the fluid grace of someone who lived her life for the lens, her heels clicking a rhythmic, arrogant tempo against the granite steps. "Smile for them, babe," Edward whispered, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "By noon, we'll be celebrating at Le Bernardin. The prenup is a steel trap. She gets the house in Connecticut and a thank you note for the memories." Tiffany giggled, a sound as bright and hollow as a wind chime, and tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow. They moved through the crowd like royalty, Edward occasionally pausing to offer a sharp, winning quip to the reporters. He felt invincible. Behind him lay a trail of broken competitors and billion-dollar contracts. Ahead of him was a future unburdened by the quiet, domestic weight of a woman who no longer fit his brand. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere shifted. The frantic energy of the paparazzi was replaced by the oppressive, wood-paneled silence of the law. The room smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the subtle metallic scent of the HVAC system. Sitting at the plaintiff's table was Ruth Clark. She didn't look up when Edward walked in. She sat with her spine perfectly straight, clad in a simple navy wool suit that Edward knew was at least 5 years old. Her hair, a soft, natural silver that she refused to dye, was pulled back into a sensible knot. To anyone else, she looked like a retired librarian. To Edward, she looked like a relic of a life he had outgrown. "Ruth," Edward said, his voice echoing a bit too loudly in the somber room. He walked over to her table, Tiffany trailing behind him like a prized trophy. "I see you brought Mr. Gable. Is he still practicing? I thought he'd retired to Florida a decade ago." Ruth finally turned her head. Her eyes were a deep, calm hazel, the color of a forest floor after rain. They were eyes that had once looked at Edward with a love so fierce it had sustained him through 3 bankruptcies and a dozen failed prototypes. Now, they were merely observant. "Harold is quite capable, Edward," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, devoid of the trembling anger he had expected. "Hi, Ruth. Love the suit. Is it vintage?" Tiffany chirped, her eyes scanning Ruth with a mix of pity and triumph. Ruth looked at the younger woman, then back to Edward. A small, sad smile touched her lips, not a smile of defeat, but of profound realization. "It's honest, Tiffany. That's more than I can say for most things in this room." Edward felt a flicker of irritation. He reached into his pocket and fingered a small, cold object. It was a vintage silver drafting compass, tarnished and heavy. He had found it on his dresser this morning, an old tool Ruth had used to hand-draw the original schematics for their first bridge-building contract in 1994. He'd intended to throw it in the trash, but for some reason he'd slipped it into his pocket. It felt like a piece of lead against his thigh. "Let's get this over with, Ruth," Edward snapped, moving to his own table where his lead counsel, Marcus Thorne, a man whose billable hour cost more than a mid-sized sedan, was waiting. "I've offered you $20 million. That's more than enough for you to live out your days in comfort. Don't make this ugly. You know how Marcus gets." Marcus Thorne didn't look up from his tablet. He simply smiled, a thin, predatory line that suggested he was already calculating how to dismantle Ruth's dignity. "$20 million? Harold Gable, Ruth's lawyer, spoke up. He was a man in his late 70s with bushy white eyebrows and a suit that smelled faintly of peppermint. He was currently squinting at a disorganized stack of folders. "Edward, that wouldn't even cover the interest on the debt Ruth carried for you in '98. Edward chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "That was a lifetime ago, Harold. We're in the world of Garcia International now, a world Ruth hasn't been a part of for years." He sat down, leaning back in the leather chair, feeling the absolute weight of his power. He glanced back at Tiffany, who was busy taking a discreet selfie in the gallery, her pout perfectly rehearsed. Suddenly, the side door opened. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Elena Harrison entered the room. She was a woman of 60, with a reputation for being a decoder. She didn't care about the theatre. She cared about the math. She took her seat, adjusted her robes, and looked over the rim of her glasses. Her gaze lingered on Edward for a moment, then moved to Ruth. "Be seated," Judge Harrison said, her voice like shifting gravel. "Docket number 8821, Garcia versus Garcia. This is a hearing for the equitable distribution of marital assets and the adjudication of the 1996 prenuptial agreement." Edward leaned into Marcus. "Stick to the '96 filing. It's ironclad. She waived all rights to the intellectual property of Garcia International before we went public." Marcus nodded confidently. "Don't worry, Edward. By the time I'm done, the court will see her as nothing more than a glorified secretary." Edward smiled, his hand brushing against the cold silver compass in his pocket. He was ready for the kill. He was ready to be free. But as Judge Harrison opened the first file, her brow furrowed. She looked at the documents, then at the lawyers, then back to Ruth. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her voice dropping an octave, "I've been reviewing the corporate charter you submitted for Garcia International. It seems we have a very significant discrepancy." Edward's smile faltered. A sudden, sharp chill, colder than the New York wind, seeped into the marrow of his bones. Edward's heart gave a single heavy thud against his ribs. He adjusted his cufflink, a nervous habit he hadn't succumbed to in years. "A discrepancy, Your Honor. I assure you, my legal team has vetted every filing with the precision of a Swiss watch." Marcus Thorne stood up, his posture projecting a calm that Edward didn't quite feel. "If Your Honor is referring to the 2004 tax restructuring, that was a standard maneuver to shield the parent company during the mid-market expansion. It has no bearing on the 1996 prenuptial agreement." Judge Harrison didn't look up from the folder. She turned a page, the sound of the paper crisp and loud, like a dry branch snapping. "I'm not looking at the 2004 tax filing, Mr. Thorne. I'm looking at the Garcia Clark Trust Incorporation papers, filed in the British Virgin Islands in 2010. The one signed by Mr. Garcia during the federal investigation into the Atlantic Bridge project." Edward felt the blood drain from his face. 2010. He remembered that year. It was the year of the dark summer. A subcontractor had cut corners, a bridge had cracked, and the Department of Justice had come knocking with subpoenas and a hunger for a high-profile scalp. Edward had been a nervous wreck, pacing their Connecticut living room, nursing a glass of neat scotch while Ruth sat at the kitchen table, calmly reviewing thousands of pages of discovery. "Edward," Marcus whispered, leaning in so close Edward could smell his expensive espresso. "What is she talking about?" "It was a protection move," Edward hissed back, his voice tight. "The feds were trying to freeze my personal assets. I moved the controlling interest into a trust. It was just a shell, a legal ghost to keep the company from being gutted while I cleared my name." Across the aisle, Harold Gable finally stopped fumbling with his peppermint-scented folders. He stood up slowly, his joints giving an audible crack that seemed to mock the high-tech silence of the room. "If I may, Your Honor," Harold said, his voice gaining a surprising resonance. "My client, Ruth Clark, was the sole trustee and the designated protector of that trust. In 2012, when the investigation concluded and the threat of asset forfeiture passed, Mr. Garcia was supposed to execute a return of interest form to bring the company shares back into his name." Harold paused, looking at Edward with a grandfatherly sadness that felt more cutting than a blade. "He never did," Harold continued. "He was so busy with the London expansion and other distractions that he ignored the 3 reminders sent by my office. He signed the corporate minutes every year since, but he never actually read the fine print. He assumed that because his name was on the building, his name was on the deed." Edward's mind raced. He remembered those folders. Ruth had brought them to him in the back of a town car on the way to JFK. He had been on the phone with a bank in Dubai, shouting about interest rates. He'd scribbled his signature on the top pages, the important ones, and handed the rest back to her, telling her to take care of the boring stuff. He looked at Ruth. She was still sitting perfectly still, but she had reached into her bag. She pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger, the original one they'd used to track their first $5,000 of revenue in 1994. "I didn't steal it, Edward," Ruth said softly, her voice carrying across the courtroom like a cool breeze. "I told you. 3 times. I told you at dinner. I told you when you were packing for Singapore. I even left the documents on your pillow the night you told me you were moving into the Soho penthouse." "She's lying!" Edward shouted, half rising from his chair. "Sit down, Mr. Garcia," Judge Harrison barked, her gavel hitting the block with a finality that made Tiffany jump in the gallery. "I have the 2012, 2015, and 2019 corporate filings right here, all signed by you, all acknowledging the Garcia Clark Trust as the 100% owner of Garcia International, and the trust documents state clearly that in the event of a dissolution of marriage, the protector, that's Mrs. Clark, retains all voting shares to ensure the stability of the enterprise." The silence that followed was suffocating. Edward looked at Marcus Thorne, but the shark was staring at the table, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. The invincible Marcus Thorne had no answer for a man who had signed away his empire because he was too busy being a visionary to read his own mail. Edward felt a sudden, sharp pain in his thigh. He realized he was gripping the silver compass in his pocket, so hard the pointed end was digging through the fabric of his trousers. Projecting power. That's what he had always told himself. If you look like you own the building, nobody asks for the deed. He had spent decades perfecting the strut, the suit, and the smile, while Ruth had spent decades holding the floorboards together. He looked back at the gallery. Tiffany was no longer looking at him. She was looking at her phone, her thumb scrolling rapidly. The pout was gone, replaced by a calculating squint. She knew the smell of a sinking ship better than anyone. "Your Honor," Marcus Thorne tried, his voice lacking its usual thunder. "This is a technicality, a clerical oversight. Mr. Garcia built this company. He is the face of the brand. To hand it to a A former spouse who hasn't held an office in years would be a disaster for the shareholders. Judge Harrison leaned forward, her eyes cold as ice. The law doesn't care about faces, Mr. Thorne. It cares about signatures. And Mr. Garcia's signature is all over the fact that he doesn't own a single brick of that company. She looked at Ruth, then at Edward. "We will take a 15-minute recess for the parties to confer," the judge said. "But let me be clear. If we go back on the record, I will be ruling based on the 2010 trust agreement. Mr. Garcia, I suggest you find a very humble tone of voice." Very quickly. As the judge exited, the room erupted into a low, frantic hum. Edward turned to Ruth, his face a mask of desperation and rage. But Ruth didn't look angry. She looked at him with the same expression she used to have when he was a young man, crying on their studio apartment floor because the math wouldn't work. A look of exhausted, maternal pity. "You forgot the most important rule of engineering, Ed," she whispered as the lawyers crowded around. "You can't build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, especially when you're the one who poured the sand." Edward opened his maw to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in 30 years, the titan of industry had nothing to say. The conference room felt smaller than it actually was. The walls, panelled in a suffocating mahogany, seemed to pulse with the rhythmic pounding of Edward's heart. He stood by the window, staring out at the hazy Manhattan skyline, his breath fogging to the glass. Behind him, the room was a hive of frantic, whispered desperation. Marcus Thorne was on a burner phone, his voice a sharp, jagged edge as he barked at someone in the British Virgin Islands. Tiffany was sitting in the corner, her fingers flying across her phone screen. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her acrylic nails was like a countdown. Edward turned, his eyes bloodshot. He walked toward Ruth, who was sitting at the long table, uncapping a thermos of tea. The scent of chamomile, calm, domestic, and utterly out of place, hit him like a slap. "Ruth, stop this," Edward said, his voice a low, desperate vibration. "You win." "Fine. You caught a mistake. I'll double the settlement. 50 million. No, 80. You can buy that vineyard in Tuscany you always talked about. You can disappear. Just tell the judge it was an oversight." Ruth didn't look up. She watched the steam rise from her cup. "I never wanted a vineyard, Edward. I wanted a partner. I wanted the man who used to stay up until dawn with me, arguing over wind load calculations for the Hudson spans. I did that for us." Edward slammed his hand on the table, the silver drafting compass in his pocket rattling against his leg. "I built this name. I am the brand. If you take the company, the stock will crater by lunchtime. The board will eat you alive. You're a mathematician, not a CEO." Tiffany suddenly stood up. The movement was sharp, lacking its usual feline grace. "Edward," she said, her voice sounding different. Thinner, colder. "Is it true? About the trust? Does she really own the shares?" Edward didn't look at her. "It's a technicality, Tiffany. Marcus is fixing it." Tiffany looked at Marcus, who had just hung up the phone with a look of defeated exhaustion. She didn't need to hear him speak. She grabbed her designer bag, the heavy gold chain clinking. "I have a photo shoot in Midtown," Tiffany said, her eyes already distant. "I should go. My agent he's blowing up my phone." "Tiffany?" Edward reached for her, but she stepped back, a reflexive flinch that cut deeper than any legal ruling. She didn't say goodbye. She walked out of the conference room, the click of her heels fading into the distance. Edward stood frozen, his hand outstretched to empty air. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of chamomile and betrayal. "The board," Edward whispered, turning back to Ruth. "They won't follow you. They don't even know who you are." "They know who you told them I was," Ruth corrected. She stood up, her navy suit crinkling slightly. "But they've been reading my memos for 20 years, Edward. They just thought they were yours." The bailiff knocked. The 15 minutes were up. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted from a divorce hearing to a corporate execution. The gallery was packed now. Word had leaked. Reporters from the financial wires were squeezed into the back pews, their laptops glowing like small, predatory eyes. Judge Harrison took the bench. "We are back on the record. Mr. Thorne, have you conferred with your client?" Marcus stood, but his shoulders were slumped. "Your Honor, we maintain that the 2010 trust was custodial. However, in the interest of a swift resolution, Mr. Garcia is prepared to offer a significantly enhanced cash settlement in exchange for the dissolution of the trust." "Mrs. Clark?" the judge asked. Ruth stood up. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked at the laptop Harold Gable had connected to the court's projector. "Your Honor, Edward has spent years telling the world, and himself, that he is the sole visionary of Garcia International. He claims that my role was purely supportive. If that were true, his nuclear option to revoke the licensing of the core engineering software, the Vanguard system, would indeed leave me with a hollow shell." Edward smirked. This was his ace. Even if she owned the shares, he personally held the patents to the software that ran every bridge and skyscraper they built. "I wrote the code, Ruth," he mouthed. "It's mine." "But," Ruth continued, her voice gaining a cold, mathematical precision, "the Vanguard system isn't based on Edward's logic. It's based on a proprietary set of recursive algorithms developed in 1994. She hit a key on the laptop. A cascade of green code filled the giant monitors on the courtroom walls. It looked like a foreign language to most, but to Edward, it was the DNA of his success. "Every engineer leaves a signature," Ruth said. "Edward's style is intuitive, bold, but this code is elegant. It's structured, and hidden in the kernel, in the dead space of the logic, is a ghost." She typed a command. "Run. Clarity check." A small text box appeared in the center of the screen. "Project Vanguard, version 1.0. Author, Ruth Clark, dedicated to EG. Build something beautiful." The courtroom went so quiet that the hum of the projector sounded like a jet engine. Edward felt the room tilt. He reached into his pocket and gripped the silver compass so hard the metal bit into his palm. "I didn't license it to the company, Edward," Ruth said, her voice echoing with a terrible quiet power. "I am the company. I let you be the face because I loved you. I let you take the credit because you needed the sun. But you forgot that the sun doesn't stay up without the sky." Judge Harrison leaned over her bench, looking at the screen with an expression of profound disgust for Edward. "Mr. Garcia," the judge said, her voice like the tolling of a bell, "it appears your foundation hasn't just cracked, it's vanished." Edward looked at Ruth, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a wife or a secretary. He saw the architect of his entire existence, and she was finally, formally, closing the door. The ghost in the machine remained on the courtroom monitors, 5 words of green text that felt more like a tombstone than a dedication. "Don't screw this up, honey." To the reporters in the gallery, it was the ultimate viral moment, the receipt of the century. To Edward, it was the sound of 30 years of his own mythology shattering like cheap glass. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Harrison said, her voice cutting through the feverish typing of the press, "does your client have a response? Can he explain why the source code of his personal intellectual property identifies his wife as the sole author 5 years before his own licensing agreement was even drafted? Marcus Thorne looked like a man standing on a trap door. He glanced at Edward, then at the screen, then back to the judge. Your Honor, my client. This is a shock to the defense. You were led to believe exactly what I wanted you to believe, Marcus, Ruth interrupted. She didn't sound triumphant. She sounded like an architect explaining a structural failure. Edward started believing his own marketing. He spent so much time on yachts and in boardrooms that he forgot how to look at the math. He forgot that every time he came home with a brilliant epiphany, I was the one who had spent 18 hours refining the logic that made it work. Edward stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, a harsh, screeching sound that made the room flinch. The silver compass in his pocket felt like a brand. I was the one who sold it, Ruth. I was the one in the rain in Chicago, pitching to the Port Authority. I was the one who took the risks. And I was the one who made sure the bridges didn't fall down, Edward, Ruth said, her voice rising for the first time. I was the one who managed the risk you didn't even understand. The courtroom doors banged open. A man in a tailored suit, looking frantic and holding a tablet, rushed toward Marcus Thorne. He whispered something, his face the color of ash. Marcus's eyes widened. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice trembling. The market has reacted. Trading on Garcia International has been halted. The board of directors is currently in an emergency session. They've just issued a statement. Edward's phone vibrated in his pocket. Then again. And again. It was the frantic, digital pulse of a dying empire. He pulled it out. Breaking. Garcia International Board removes Edward Garcia as CEO, citing fraudulent IP claims and catastrophic loss of confidence. Rumor. Board reaches out to Ruth Clark for interim leadership. Edward looked at the screen, then at the board members who were already slipping out of the back of the room to avoid the cameras. His golf buddies. The men he'd shared vintage cognac with in the executive lounge. They weren't just leaving him, they were erasing him. This is a coup, Edward whispered, his voice cracking. Ruth, you orchestrated this. You've been planning this since the trust was signed. No, Ed, Ruth said, picking up her leather-bound ledger. I've been ready for this. There's a difference. I would have stayed in the shadows forever if you'd just remained the man I built that foundation with. But you decided that I was a liability. You decided I was old tech. You didn't just try to divorce me. You tried to delete me. Judge Harrison slammed her gavel at her. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Enough. The evidence is incontrovertible. The 2010 trust agreement stands. The intellectual property rights for the Vanguard system are the sole property of Ruth Clark. Mr. Garcia, your nuclear option is dead. In fact, since Garcia International is currently using software that you do not own and have no right to license, the company is technically in breach of its own government contracts. Edward felt the room spinning. He looked toward the gallery, searching for Tiffany, searching for any face that looked at him with admiration. But Tiffany was gone, and the reporters were no longer looking at him as a titan. They were looking at him as a fraud. A placeholder. Mrs. Clark, the judge continued, as the protector of the trust and the owner of the IP, you are the only person who can save this company from immediate bankruptcy and federal investigation. Do you have a proposal? Ruth stood tall. For the first time, the retired librarian look was gone, replaced by a cold, luminous authority. I do, Your Honor. I'm calling an immediate freeze on all corporate accounts associated with Edward Garcia. I am revoking his security clearance, effective 60 seconds ago, and I am requesting an immediate injunction to bar him from all company properties, including the Manhattan headquarters. Edward lunged toward the table, his hand reaching out, not to strike, but to beg. But as he moved, the silver drafting compass fell from his pocket. It hit the floor with a dull metallic clink and skittered across the wood, stopping right at Ruth's feet. Ruth looked down at the small, tarnished tool. She remembered buying it for him with her first paycheck from the diner. She remembered him using it to draw the very first curve of the Atlantic Bridge. She didn't pick it up. She stepped over it. "Security," Judge Harrison called out. 2 bailiffs stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts. They didn't look at Edward with respect. They looked at him as a trespasser. "Mr. Garcia," one of the guards said, his voice flat. "It's time to go." Edward looked at Ruth one last time. He expected to see a gleam of revenge in her eyes, a spark of sweet karma. But all he saw was a profound, quiet exhaustion. She wasn't celebrating his downfall. She was simply finishing the work. As the guards took his arms, Edward felt the first true realization of his new reality. He wasn't the king. He was the ghost. And the woman he had spent 30 years ignoring was the only one left in the room who actually knew how to build anything. The hallway outside courtroom 4B was a feeding frenzy. The moment the double door swung open, the strobe light flash of the paparazzi turned the world into a flickering, black and white nightmare. Edward Garcia, the man who had walked in like a god, was now being ushered through a corridor of shouting voices and shoved microphones. "Edward, is it true your wife wrote the Vanguard Code? Mr. Garcia, how does it feel to be fired from your own company? Where's Tiffany, Edward?" Edward didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt like it had been lined with crushed glass. He kept his head down, staring at the polished marble floor, following the heavy black boots of the bailiffs. He reached the curb where his black armored SUV, the vehicle that cost more than most people's homes, was idling. The driver, a man named Sam who had worked for Edward for 12 years, stepped out. But he didn't open the door. He stood with his hands folded, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Sam!" Edward barked, his old authority flickering for a second. "Get the door. Let's go. Take me to the Soho penthouse." Sam looked at the bailiff, then back to Edward. "I'm sorry, Mr. Garcia. I just got the word from corporate security. This vehicle is owned by the Garcia Clark Trust. My instructions are to return it to the depot and wait for Mrs. Clark." Edward blinked. The air seemed to thin. "I pay your salary, Sam." "Actually, sir," Sam said, his voice quiet but firm, "the company pays my salary, and I've been told my employment is now under review by the interim board." Sam got back into the car and pulled away. Edward stood on the sidewalk, the biting October wind whipping his $6,000 jacket around his waist. He reached into his pocket for his phone to call an Uber, only to find the screen was black. A single message was burned into the display. "Device deactivated by system administrator." He looked up at the glass towers of Manhattan. They looked different now, not like a playground he owned, but like a jagged, indifferent canyon. He was a billionaire who couldn't even call a cab. Inside the courtroom, the silence was thick and heavy, like a fog. Ruth remained at the table, her hands resting on the leather-bound ledger. She heard the distant roar of the press outside, a sound like a retreating tide. Harold Gable began packing his peppermint-scented folders. "You did it, Ruth. The board is waiting for you at Hudson Yards. They've already fired Miller and the rest of Edward's inner circle. They're terrified of the IP lawsuit. They'll give you anything you want." Ruth didn't respond. She stood up and walked to the center of the room. There, on the floor, lay the silver drafting compass. She knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and picked it up. The metal was cold, but as she gripped it, she felt a strange, hollow ache. This little tool had drawn the curves of their lives. It had defined their trajectory. And somewhere along the way, the needle had slipped. "I don't want anything, Harold," Ruth said, her voice small in the empty room. "I just want to see if the foundation is still there." An hour later, Ruth walked into the lobby of Garcia International. It was a cathedral of steel and glass, designed by Edward to intimidate. The security guards, men who usually snapped to attention for Edward, stood paralyzed as she approached. They had seen the news. They knew the quiet wife was now the landlord. She didn't use the executive elevator. She took the main lift, standing among the junior analysts and engineers. They looked at her with a mix of awe and terror. She didn't look like a titan. She looked like the person who had written the code they spent their lives maintaining. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, the board of directors was already lined up in the hallway. These were the men Edward had played golf with, the men who had toasted to his brilliance. They were smiling now, sickly, desperate smiles. "Ruth, we were just saying, we always knew you were the brains. A historic day for the company, Mrs. Clark." Ruth walked past them without a word. She headed straight for the CEO's office, the inner sanctum. She pushed open the heavy oak doors. The room smelled of Edward's expensive cigars and arrogance. A half-full glass of scotch sat on the desk. Ruth walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out. From here, you could see the Atlantic Bridge, its majestic silver cables shimmering in the afternoon light. "Build something beautiful." She looked down at the desk. There was a framed photo of Edward on the cover of Time. She turned it face down. Then, she sat in the chair. It was too big. It was designed to swallow a person, to make them feel larger than life. She reached into her bag, pulled out the silver compass, and placed it on the mahogany desk. It looked tiny against the vast expanse of the wood. A knock at the door. It was the head of engineering, a woman in her 30s named Sarah, whom Ruth had mentored from a distance for years. "Mrs. Clark?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "The Sentinel project. The Navy contract. Edward told us to cut the safety margins to save on the lithium costs. We were going to resign today." Ruth looked at the young woman. She saw herself 30 years ago, smart, fierce, and tired of being told to be quiet. "Get the schematics, Sarah," Ruth said, her voice gaining a steady, resonant power. "And call the fabrication plant in Ohio. Tell them we're going back to the original 1994 specs. We aren't cutting margins. We're building for a century, not a fiscal quarter." Sarah beamed, a genuine, radiant smile. "Yes, Ma'am." As Sarah rushed out, Ruth leaned back and closed her eyes. She had the company. She had the power. She had the revenge. But as the sun began to set over the Hudson, casting long, bloody shadows across the office, she realized that the sweetness of the victory was fleeting. The hard part was just beginning. She had to save the empire Edward had almost burned down for a vanity project. And Edward? He was out there in the cold, realizing that without the crown, he wasn't just a king in exile. He was a man who had forgotten how to walk. The A-train was a rattling, subterranean cage of screeching metal and the smell of damp wool. Edward Garcia sat on a cracked plastic seat, his $6,000 charcoal suit looking like a costume in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light. To his left, a teenager with neon green headphones was nodding to a beat Edward couldn't hear. To his right, an old man was slumped over a bundle of recyclables. For 30 years, Edward had viewed the world from 30,000 feet, or behind the tinted glass of a Maybach. He had forgotten the specific, gritty texture of the city, the way the subway air tasted of ozone and ancient dust. He looked at his hands. They were clean, manicured, and utterly useless. He had tried his key at the Soho penthouse. The black titanium lock, a custom piece he'd bragged about to the board, had remained stubbornly red. The doorman, a man Edward had tipped $1,000 every Christmas, had looked at him with a pained, squinting discomfort. "I'm sorry, Mr. Garcia. The trust sent a sheriff. Your personal items are being inventoried. I've been instructed not to let you past the foyer." Edward had walked 3 blocks before he realized he had no destination. Tiffany wasn't answering. Likely she was already drafting a "My Truth" post with her publicist. His friends were silent. His accounts were ice. He reached into his pocket and felt only the lining. He had left the silver compass on the floor of the courtroom. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss. Not for the company, but for that little piece of metal. It was the only thing he'd had that was actually real. He got off at 14th Street and began to walk. The wind was picking up, biting through his silk-lined sleeves. He saw his own face on a newsstand. The Fall of the Titan. The headline was bold, black, and final. Below it was a picture of Ruth, looking calm and formidable. He ended up in a 24-hour diner in Chelsea. It was a place of greasy chrome and the smell of burnt coffee. A place that looked exactly like the one where Ruth used to work double shifts in 1994, so he could buy the high-end processors for his first server. He sat in a vinyl booth that stuck to his trousers. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Mina, slid a menu onto the table. "Just coffee," Edward said, his voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. "Cream? Sugar? Black." He reached into his pocket out of habit to pull out a gold clip of $100 bills, then froze. He remembered he had exactly $42 in cash, money he'd pulled from his dresser that morning, for tips. He watched the steam rise from the thick ceramic mug. He was Edward Garcia. He was a visionary. He was a billionaire. But as he looked at his reflection in the darkened window of the diner, he saw a stranger. He saw a man who had built a skyscraper and forgotten to include a door for himself. Meanwhile, 50 floors above the city, Ruth was discovering just how deep the rot went. She wasn't in the CEO's office. She was in the basement archives, a vast, climate-controlled vault of physical blueprints and old ledgers. She was sitting on a rolling stool, surrounded by the paper trail of the last decade. "He wasn't just cutting margins, Sarah," Ruth said, her voice echoing off the steel shelves. Sarah, the head of engineering, stood beside her, holding a tablet. "Look at these invoices," Ruth continued, pointing to a series of payments to a firm called Vane Consulting. He was funneling R&D funds into Tiffany's brand development. Millions of dollars meant for the Atlantic Bridge's sensor array were spent on influencer trips to Ibiza and Malibu. He didn't just ignore the foundation, he was actively selling the bricks. Sarah looked horrified. "Ruth, if the DOT finds out about the sensor array gaps, they'll pull our certification. We could lose everything. The company could be liquidated by the end of the month." Ruth stood up. The fatigue was a heavy weight on her shoulders, but her eyes were clear. The quiet wife was gone. The mathematician was in her element. She was solving for X, and X was the survival of 30,000 employees and the integrity of the bridges that held the city together. "We don't wait for them to find out," Ruth said. "We self-report. We bring in an independent audit tonight. We stop the bleeding, and we tell the truth. Edward built a lie, Sarah. We're going to build a recovery." "It'll tank the stock even further," Sarah warned. "Let it tank," Ruth said, her voice like iron. "I'd rather own a company worth $1 that stands than a $40 billion empire that's waiting to fall." She walked toward the elevator but paused. She looked at the old ledger in her hand, the one from 1994. "Sarah," Ruth said softly, Do you know where Edward is? Sarah hesitated. Security said he left the building on foot. He didn't have a car. They saw him heading toward the subway. Ruth looked at the polished steel doors of the elevator. She thought of Edward in his bespoke suit, standing on a subway platform. She thought of the 30 years they had spent together, the way his laugh used to fill a room before it became a weapon. She reached into her bag and felt the silver compass she had retrieved from the courtroom floor. She hadn't thrown it away. She couldn't. He's learning the hardest math there is, Ruth whispered, more to herself than to Sarah. The value of 0. She stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the archives. She had a company to save and a legacy to rewrite. But as she ascended toward the boardroom, she couldn't shake the image of Edward sitting in a diner somewhere, realizing for the first time that the coffee was cold and he was completely, utterly alone. Edward didn't go to a hotel. He didn't go to the few remaining associates who hadn't yet blocked his number. Instead, driven by a ghost memory he hadn't accessed in decades, he took the 7 train out to Long Island City. He walked past the revitalized glass condos and trendy breweries until the sidewalk turned to cracked asphalt and the smell of the East River grew thick with brine. He stopped in front of a narrow, 4-story brick walk-up. The Garcia Clark nameplate was gone, replaced by a generic plastic sticker. But the chipped green paint on the door was the same. This was the studio where it had begun. They had kept the deed in a separate, small holding company, a sentimental asset Edward had mocked during their last good year. He'd forgotten it existed until the doorman at the Soho penthouse turned him away. He reached under the loose brick near the rusted radiator, a hiding spot from 1994. His fingers brushed cold metal, the spare key. The apartment smelled of dust and the fainter, lingering scent of pine sol. It was small, barely 400 square feet. A single drafting table stood in the corner, its surface scarred by decades of compass points and ink spills. There was no mahogany, no silk, no ego. Edward sat on the floor, his back against the radiator, and watched the moonlight crawl across the linoleum. He realized he was waiting. He wasn't sure for what, a miracle, a phone call, or the end of the world. The end of the world arrived at 2 a.m. in the form of a soft knock. Edward opened the door. Ruth stood in the hallway. She looked exhausted, her navy suit replaced by a heavy coat and a scarf. She wasn't accompanied by lawyers or guards. She was alone. "I figured you'd be here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you know?" Edward asked. "Because it's the only place left where the floorboards are real," she said, stepping inside. She looked around the small room. "The board wanted to sell this last year. I blocked the motion. I told them it was a strategic reserve. I think I just wanted one place where you weren't a statue." Edward looked at his shoes. "I'm not a statue anymore, Ruth. I'm a ghost." Ruth walked to the drafting table and ran her hand over the scarred wood. "The audit came back, Edward. I had to self-report the vain consulting invoices to the SEC tonight. If I didn't, the company would have been an accomplice. I did it to save the 30,000 families who rely on those paychecks." Edward felt a cold, sharp dread settle in his stomach. "And the FBI will be at your door, wherever your door is, by morning," Ruth said. Her eyes were wet, reflecting the dim light of the street lamp outside. "The embezzlement, the fraudulent IP claims. They're going to seek an indictment. Marcus Thorne has already turned over his files in exchange for immunity. He's claiming you coerced the legal filings." Edward let out a short, jagged laugh. "Marcus, of course. The shark only eats what's bleeding." He sank back down onto the radiator, covering his face with his hands. The hard karma hadn't just hit, it had leveled him. He wasn't just losing his money, He was losing his freedom. The billionaire strut had led him directly into a cage. "Why did you come here, Ruth?" Edward asked through his fingers. "To watch the arrest? To get the final, 'I told you so'?" "No," Ruth said. She sat on the edge of the drafting table, the same way she used to when they were 25 and dreaming of bridges. "I came to give you this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver drafting compass. She held it out to him, the tarnished metal gleaming in her palm. "You left it in the courtroom," she said. "I thought, if you're going to go through what's coming, you should have something that was made of real silver. Something that actually draws a true circle." Edward reached out and took the tool. His hand trembled. The weight of it felt monumental, heavier than the keys to the Maybach, heavier than the black titanium access cards. "Ruth," Edward said, his voice breaking, I really did love the work. In the beginning, I loved the way the numbers made sense. I loved the way you made the numbers make sense." "I know," Ruth said softly, "but you started loving the reflection of the work more than the work itself. You started building bridges to get to the other side, and you forgot that a bridge is supposed to hold people up." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the distant hum of the city and the rhythmic clanking of the old radiator. There was no more sweet revenge. There was only the wreckage of a life and the two people who had built it together. "Will the company survive?" Edward asked. "It will," Ruth said, her voice firm. "It'll be smaller, it'll be humbler, but it will be honest. I'm stepping down as CEO once the restructuring is complete. I'm going back to the lab. I'm going to teach Sarah how to write the next kernel." "You were always the better engineer," Edward admitted. "I was always the only engineer, Ed," she corrected, but without malice. She stood up and walked to the door. She paused, her hand on the knob. "The FBI will be here at 8 a.m., she said. "I told them I'd let them know where you were. I'm giving you until then. To be alone. To be Ruth and Ed one last time." She didn't look back. The door clicked shut, leaving Edward in the dark with a silver compass and the realization that he had finally found his way back to the foundation, only to find he was the only one left standing on it. The sun rose over the East River with an indifferent, golden clarity, spilling across the floor of the Long Island City studio. At exactly 8 a.m., there was no dramatic kick of the door. There was only a steady, respectful knock. Edward stood up, his suit jacket folded neatly over the drafting table. He picked up the silver compass, looked at it one last time, and slipped it into his pocket. When he opened the door, he didn't see the vultures he had spent his life fearing. He saw 3 officers who looked remarkably like the people he used to work with before he became a titan. He went with them quietly. 2 years later, the grey slush of a New York February was beginning to yield to a tentative, pale green spring. Ruth Clark sat in the back of a taxi, crossing the Atlantic Bridge. She looked up at the massive silver cables, the ones she had reinforced with the sensor arrays Edward had tried to delete. The bridge stood firm, humming with the vibration of 10,000 cars, a silent testament to the math that didn't lie. She had stepped down as CEO 6 months ago, handing the reins to Sarah. The company was smaller now. It no longer occupied 3 floors of a Hudson Yards glass tower. It was debt-free, and for the first time in its history, the engineers outranked the marketers. She asked the driver to pull over at a small community center in Queens. The building was a repurposed warehouse, smelling of fresh sawdust and industrial floor cleaner. Inside, in a room filled with drafting tables and low-hanging lamps, a group of 15 teenagers were huddled around a central workspace. Edward Garcia stood at the head of the class. He wasn't wearing Brioni. He was wearing a sturdy denim shirt and khakis. His hair was completely silver now, no longer disguised by the expensive Zurich dyes. He looked older, certainly, but the frantic, vibrating energy of the man who had to own the room was gone. He looked settled, like a stone that had finally found its place in a wall. "You see the curve?" Edward was saying to a young girl who was struggling with a protractor. "It's not just about aesthetics, it's about how the weight travels. If you lie to the drawing will lie to the steel, and steel never forgets a lie." He looked up as the door creaked. He saw Ruth. The class shifted, sensing a change in the air, but Edward simply nodded. "Take 5, everyone. Check your tolerances." He walked over to Ruth, wiping graphite from his fingers with a rag. "You're late. The board meeting ended an hour ago." "I'm not on the board anymore, Ed," Ruth said, a small, genuine smile lighting up her hazel eyes. "I'm just a consultant and a traveler. I'm going to London tomorrow to see the bridge we built in '99. Edward leaned against a drafting table, the one with the recursive arches. "I remember. You stayed up for 40 hours straight to fix the lateral sway." "We did," she corrected softly. There was a long silence between them. Not the suffocating, bitter silence of the courtroom, but a quiet, reflective space. The betrayal was a scar now, not an open wound. The hard karma of the trial and his subsequent year of house arrest and community service had stripped Edward of his empire, but it had returned to him his soul. "I have something of yours," Edward said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver drafting compass. He had polished it. The tarnish was gone, and it caught the afternoon sun, gleaming with a soft, honest light. He placed it on the table between them. "I've been using it to teach them," he said. "It still draws a perfect circle. Every time." Ruth reached out and touched the metal. "Keep it, Ed. I think you're finally learning how to hold it." She turned to leave, but paused, looking back at the man who had once been a titan and was now, finally, a teacher. "Are you coming to the rededication of the Atlantic Bridge next month? Sarah would love to have you there." Edward looked at the teenagers in his class, then back at the woman who had been the author of his life. "Maybe. I have a lot of grading to do. These kids, they're brilliant, Ruth, but they need to learn that the foundation is the most important part. I think they have a good teacher for that," she said. Ruth walked out of the community center and into the bright, crisp afternoon. She didn't look back. Behind her, in the quiet room, Edward picked up a pencil and began to draw. It was a simple line, a humble beginning, but it was true, and in the city of glass and steel, that was enough. If you were moved by Ruth and Edward's journey from betrayal to the quiet strength of authenticity, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This story serves as a reminder that while power can be taken, integrity must be built, one honest line at a time. What would you have done in Ruth's shoes? Would you have offered a second chance, or was the sweet revenge of the courtroom enough? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Stay tuned for more stories of karma, redemption, and the resilience of the human spirit.